great pause. The short-term shock from the COVID shutdown to the economy is huge, as we all know, and many of you would have seen the Office of Budget Responsibilities assessment of a reduction in economic activity that we're currently experiencing. And the UK government's economic policy response, its initial economic policy response to that shutdown, has been innovative and decisive in the hope that we can engineer a V-shaped recovery, a rapid bounce back to former levels of economic activity once the initial health crisis is past. And that intervention has involved unprecedented monetary and financial easing measures, the job retention scheme, multiple business loans and grants to tide companies over until the worst of the health crisis is over. But the question really today is, will these work? Will these measures work? What do we now know? What are we starting to learn about the likely long-term impact of the coronavirus and the shutdown on the economy? And what policy measures should we now be thinking of to minimise the long-term hit to our living standards, both in terms of microeconomic policy interventions, but also in terms of the macroeconomic policy response that will be required over the coming years. And I'm delighted that we've got three excellent speakers to discuss this with today. Alistair Darling, Chancellor from 2007 to 2010 during the financial crisis, Professor Wendy Carlin of UCL, and expert advisor to the Office of Budget Responsibility, and Rupert Harrison of BlackRock and former Chief of Staff to George Osborne from 2010 to 2015. So we will kick off with initial contributions from our panelists and then open the discussion up to Q&A from all of you on the line. Now, just some housekeeping rules. I'm sure many of you are familiar with how these Zoom webinars work now, but just to clarify that everyone will be on mute apart from the panelists. If you have a question, please either raise your hand in the hand raising function, or type your question, even better, type your question into the box or an outline of it, and I will come to you and unmute you to ask it. We will be recording the whole webinar and it will be put online later on today or tomorrow. And we have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, so I may have to miss out some questions or bring answers to a rapid close. So I hope you'll bear with me on that. But we're looking forward to a great discussion. And if I may, I'll hand over at this point to Wendy to kick us off and get the discussion started.
Great, thanks very much, Ian. It's great to be here talking about these issues. So what I thought I'd begin with is just how I think about this so-called great pause, and I think of kind of three elements, and maybe that's a good way to kind of get us going. So if we have this epidemic spreading with the reproduction rate above 1, then we have to have a government-induced pause on economic activity. So we have to have a government-induced recession that interrupts the disease transmission network. And that also has to interrupt the gains from trade networks. So kind of thinking about these overlapping networks, I think can be helpful. It also helps us to understand why the burden falls so unequally, because the gains from trade for people like me, many of us here who can work remotely, are unaffected by severing the connections, the personal connections that we have to cut to stop the disease transmission. So that's kind of that's where we began. And then if we're trying to think about the length and depth of this government-induced recession, then I think it depends on the design and effectiveness of what we might call the government's pandemic resilience strategy, because that's the only way that we can get out of the lockdown phase. And this centers on what's sometimes called TTSI, testing, tracing, and social isolation. And what seems now to be emerging is that the cross-country variation in the size of initial recessions, just focusing on the high-income countries, looks like it depends a lot on this. So on this pandemic resilience strategy. So the East Asian countries, Australia and New Zealand, have done much better than Europe and the US, and the UK doesn't look terribly good on this. So that's the second, the determinants of the length and the speed, the length and the depth of the recession. Then the third is the speed of recovery from the induced recession and its ultimate cost. And that seems to depend on the willingness and the ability of the government to use its balance sheet as insurer of last resort to its citizens to sustain economic relationships and incomes in the recession that it necessarily had to bring about. So here, as Ian said in the introduction, the UK has done a lot. On the fiscal side, it's sort of come close. If you look at the various estimates from the OBR, the IMF, from Bloomberg and so on, it comes close to filling the gap in income created by the recession. So this kind of is what lies behind the sort of bounce back scenarios that most forecasters have, at least as one of their scenarios. There's been good coordination of fiscal and monetary policy, a sensible approach to direct monetary financing. And of course, the debt burden will go up, just like in a war. This is a signal of good policy. The state is a shock absorber, and we should help to make sure this is well understood, because this is what we would expect and what, as I said, reflects good policy making. The very, very low interest rate environment that we're in is also reassuring, because it's the added interest associated with a higher debt comes with a very low at a very low cost. So I think a better job could maybe be done to communicate this. Confidence about these fiscal and monetary measures as minimizing the cost of the government-induced recession depends, however, on the coherence of the second thing I talked about, which is this pandemic resilience strategy. So, you know, that's why I think keeping this structure in mind is helpful in disciplining discussion. Longer term, you also were trying to raise questions about that. And this is the issue of what the shape of the recession will be. And if you look at the OBR's reference scenario, it's a nice V-shaped recovery. That would be an indication of good policy well implemented. Then there's talk of a W, which would occur if there was a second wave and there had to be another government-induced recession. But the real problem, I think, is what we might call an L-shaped trajectory. And that's what happened in the Great Recession following the global financial crisis. So we didn't get a return to previous trend growth. We had a permanent loss of output. And even worse, the growth rate since 2010 has been lower than before. Okay, so no bounce back and no return to the previous not incredibly impressive growth rate. So that really is asking the question, what are the lessons that we could take from that very different context? But, you know, there are sometimes we can learn by making comparisons. And in my view, austerity was implemented too soon. There was too much of an obsession with the deficit and debt. And this hampered the growth and kind of locked the UK into this L-shaped trajectory. It's partly maybe also responsible for some of the weaknesses that have been displayed very visibly in this crisis, and particularly in the social care sector. Scarring is much discussed as a consequence of the current crisis, and that's what you get in an L-shaped recovery. And because of the special nature of this recession, right? The economy was just chugging along and then the government shuts it down. We really have to focus on maintaining the fundamentally sound businesses and relationships in the economy. And that's why the design of the furlough scheme is a good one. We're trying to keep those relationships going. and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these questions. I wanted just to, before I exhausted my time, is to mention startups. I think sometimes startups are neglected because it's them not happening that is characteristic of recessions. The ones that do happen in recessions tend to exit more quickly and not to grow into the kinds of startups that in normal times are the source of about half of productivity growth and jobs growth. So really focusing attention on startups, I think, is and what can be done for them in this particular kind of crisis is something that we should be focusing on.
That's great. Thanks, Wendy. And I mean, just at the end there, you mentioned helping businesses that are fundamentally sound. But I guess one of the questions that I suppose we'll get into, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts on is, how much of a problem do you think it is that we're perhaps changing our view about what the long-term shape of the economy is, and therefore what businesses are sound? Does that, I mean, how much of an issue is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's something that makes this all the more complicated, and I actually see that as an opportunity as well. So I think that we can do things that help to shape the changes that we would want to see in the economy, and this particularly relates to the green transition. So that one of the big problems at the moment is the lack of certainty about what the economy is going to look like. But we know one thing for sure, which is that we have to be moving towards the zero net carbon economy. So for that particular future shape, we can, I think, help to guide investment and innovation decisions, both of existing firms and also of startups. So that's one connection between thinking about longer term viability and also signaling to firms that are thinking about reorienting their business, because maybe they think that there isn't a long-term future for the kind of activity that they were doing before, but they have a good team, for example. Okay, so what should they be thinking about? And having clarity about the regulatory environment going forward is going to facilitate that kind of decision making.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on. Alistair, over to you to take it from there.
Well, my starting point is this, that our ability to recover from this and the rate at which we do it depends to a large extent, I think, on the decisions that the government will take, maybe in the next 3 to 4 weeks. We need a plan for getting out of the lockdown. I'm not arguing that that can happen today or next week. We need, for health reasons, to do what we're doing at the moment, to a large extent, remaining at home. But the government now has to give people confidence, and dare I say hope, in relation to how things will return to where people can get out and about and go to work. There's going to be some restrictions that will exist throughout this year and probably into next year, and we're going to have to live with that. But the refusal to engage in having a plan, I think, has been a big mistake. And if indeed the Prime Minister does announce one, which I understand he may do, then the sooner people can get to engage with that and to talk about it, the better it will be. The second thing I want to say is in relation to the cost of all this. Now, my view is that the government has no alternative but to support the economy in the way that it's doing, and they will have to continue to do that. You know, I did a similar thing 10 years ago. When things collapse all about you, the government is the lender, an insurer, and sometimes a provider of last resort. So although the debt levels will be much, much higher, I think you do have to look at the comparison as wartime situation. You have no alternative, because our ability to recover will also depend to a very large extent too on having the infrastructure, having the fabric of the economy on which to build. If we let that go, if we let people go out of work, lose skills, if we let firms collapse on a dramatic scale, we will pay the cost of that for years to come. So the government shouldn't be obsessed with this, that, you know, we'll have to deal with it in time, but, you know, the idea that that should be a constraint, or that you can go back into austerity Mark II, I think would be a profound mistake. Obviously, the first priority is to control the virus, and I can't see how you can do that if you don't have a testing regime in which people have got confidence. I'm not going to go back to work into an office if I don't know that it's safe to do so. And we've been very slow off the mark here compared with other countries, and we need to step that up. And above all, explain to people who is going to get tested, because the messaging here seems to be, seems to change from day to day. And we also, on the economic front, we need to maintain what's being done at the moment, bearing in mind that announcing these things, economic help, is dead easy. Actually making sure you deliver them is much harder, and the government needs to concentrate on that. As for recovery, I've seen the discussions that followed the publication of the Office of Budget Responsibility report on whether there's a V shape, a U shape, an L shape. I would love to see a V-shaped recovery, but it isn't going to happen. There's no way it's going to happen, partly because we're going to have social distancing for some considerable time to come. So I think this recovery will be much more gradual. I know I can be cautious or even pessimistic on these things. My suggestion in 2008 that the recession then was going to be longer and deeper than people thought wasn't exactly greeted with approval. But I'm afraid this is much, much worse because we're not yet in control of events. We could deal with the banking crash in fairly quickly, but this is taking a lot longer. And I fear that what we're looking at is something that looks more like an L-shaped recovery, perhaps with the bottom bit curving up as things progress. But it will take time. Bear in mind, we started applying stimulus to the economy in 2008. It didn't start growing until the beginning of 2010. This one is much worse, so it will take time. I think the other thing that is critical 10 years ago, and which we don't have just now, and which will also drive our economic recovery and our prospects, is the lack of international cooperation. It was absolutely critical in 2009, and we need to work very hard to ensure that countries support each other, because we do live in a globalized world, whether we like it or not. And just as an aside, I'm not refighting the Brexit campaign, but really, in the way that our economy is going to be at the turn of this year, exactly why you'd want to then shoot yourselves in both feet, I'm not sure. And I don't think anyone would lose face if you put the thing off for 18 months or whatever. As far as recovery is concerned, I said that the government is the lender and insurer and provider of last resort, and so it is. That's going to have to continue for some time. And the measures you actually implement, like if you did a temporary VAT reduction or whatever, that will depend on the circumstances. But the government's got to remain open to these suggestions, because my guess is the approach will need adapting, it'll need changing as things go on. I also think we need to do some thinking about what the world will look like in the future. And this is difficult because there are so many unknowns here. But I just mentioned one thing that I think we need to get right. And that is, we have relied in our economy for a long time now on people who are coming in and out of work, the gig economy, people who are working on low pay, for low wages, and who've got no financial resilience. If I might put a plug in for a research organization I chair, the Standard Life Foundation, it published findings today from a monthly tracking poll, which show that nearly 7 million people in this country see themselves as being having lost income and being in poor financial straits. And part of that is they don't have the resilience that they do have in other countries. So we've got to look at that. And of course, there's other issues we've got to look at too, in relation to what the economy is going to look like. We need to plan now, even though it may be some time before further policy actions are put in place. But we should be prepared for the long haul. The crucial thing, though, as I say, bear in mind, is we've got, before you can take any of these decisions, to make sure there's an economy there in the first place, that there are for businesses, that people are in work, and making sure that those people, especially on the low incomes, are being supported. The final thing I would say, also in relation to planning, is resilience. This pandemic has shown we didn't have resilience, crucially in the NHS, testing, the issue of protective equipment, masks and so on. There are times when it looks like we just didn't know what we were doing. We got into self-isolation far too late, in my view. So we need to look at the whole question of resilience. That's what governments are for. People expect governments to plan ahead. We won't always get it right. Governments do make mistakes, but we need to do that. And the last thing is, people are looking for a bit of hope just now. And if they want, and to get hope, you need confidence and you get leadership. And that's really what the government needs to concentrate on now.
Thanks, Alistair. That's great. If I could just pick up, I mean, it's slightly off the strict question of the future, the long-term impact on the economy, but it touches on it. You mentioned there about resilience, and particularly about the resilience of, for example, the demand and expectations on public services after this will be that they should be improved, they should be better, that the safety net maybe needs to be looked at, and the kind of what's there to look after people when they get hit by a shock like this. But at the same time, we've got this potentially quite significant hit to the tax base that could go on for many years. So we have this sort of widening gulf between expectations of public spending, I sense, and the capacity of the state to fund it. From kind of Labour's perspective, what do you think gives? What would your advice be, and how they should think about this problem?
Well, the first thing is that if you don't have a functioning economy that generates tax revenues, you won't have the money to spend. Now, that'll take time to build that up, which is precisely why government borrows in order to, keep things going. As a classic Keynesian response to these things. This time it's going to be a lot longer. Now, all these bills have to be paid at the end of the day. It's worth bearing in mind, I think the GDP debt ratio at the end of the Second World War was 270%. And we didn't actually get rid of it until probably the late 1970s. So, I think you have to take a long-term view there. And equally, you talk about safety nets there. I would like to get ourselves into a situation where a lot of people who are now relying on a safety net, if you like, don't need to. And maybe it means that goods and services are going to cost more because you have to pay people, rather more than they're being paid at the moment. And equally, if we're going to be more resilient, it means that we're going to have to do some things ourselves that, for the last few years, we've been getting from countries on other sides of the world. So there will be a cost there. But if I was in the Treasury now, or if I was advising the Labour Party now, or the government for that matter, I would say the key thing at the moment, as I said right at the start, the decisions we make in the next couple of weeks or so are going to be critical. How do we safely get out of this and get our economy moving again? That's what we should be concentrating on. I'm just a bit wary about people saying, well, what should we be doing? What should the economy look like in 5 or 10 years' time? We've got to get there first.
Great. Okay, Rupert, over to you.
Sure, thanks. Look, going third, there's a lot that I agree with, particularly about the analysis of what's going on. I just want to make 4 points. One is in the very short term, the path of the economy is going to be determined by what Alistair and Mehdi were talking about in terms of how you manage exit from lockdown. And in a sense, the recovery, I think, even for the rest of this year, is not going to be determined by kind of conventional macroeconomics. It's not going to be about the scale of fiscal or monetary stimulus, because in a sense, we have got the kind of foot full down on the accelerator from the conventional policy point of view, but actually we have still got the foot full on the brake, and actually it's releasing the brake that is going to be more important in terms of the path of the economy, I think, for the rest of this year. Sadly on that, I think we should plan for the worst. I think that I sense, I share a lot of Alistair's frustration, and you can feel that out there, that people want to get back to normal. I think that it's going to take a very, very long time, and we have to be ready for this taking much longer than people expect. If you look into what is required in order to release economies while maintaining the spread of the disease within manageable limits, it's very difficult. I think we had some very concerning news from Germany, for example, where the German statisticians believe that even the release that they've already done in terms of letting people get back to work has already brought their R0 number up close to 1. And that is, I think, a very negative signal for us and other countries. But I think that is the only way to do this. So I think that there is a kind of understanding now that there's a certain number of conditions need to be in place. We need to get daily new infections down to a number that is manageable to do test and trace. You can't be having still 20,000 new infections a day and expect to control the spread of the disease through test and trace. There isn't going to be the capacity to do that in any country. So unfortunately, that means the longer lockdown, I think, than people expect, in order to get the level of infections, not detected, but true daily infections down to where you can do test and trace. Have that test and trace regime in place. I think the ONS survey that is being set up to kind of manage to sort of try and monitor R0 on a kind of real-time basis is going to be crucial. And we're therefore going to have these gradual loosening steps, and in real time learning what that does to R0, and that learning process will be crucial. And if it turns out that actually we can't do very much without allowing R0 to get to 1 quite quickly, that's going to be very, very bad news. And we're going to have to think very carefully about what we do in that situation and how long we can manage this kind of lockdown. I mean, I have to say, I think this is the right approach, because I think probably the worst outcome from a economic situation, and happily probably also the worst outcome from a political situation, so I suspect the incentives are aligned, is a significant second wave. I think that would be really catastrophic for the economy, because a lot of firms that I think had held on through this initial episode would fold in a second wave. I think that banks would behave very, very differently in a second wave, because we would have to start to extrapolate this kind of going on for some time. And I think the incentive to just pull the plug and try and get assets back as quick as possible rather than suffer further losses would be overwhelming in the banking system, very difficult to counter. And also markets, I think, would extrapolate from a second wave very, very negatively, and you'd get all of that kind of market disruption, much, much worse, feeding through to the macroeconomy. So I do think that guiding the exit in terms of avoiding a second wave is both economically and politically the right thing to do. And I think therefore that is the kind of right frame for the medium term, or probably at least the rest of this year. In terms of I totally agree that the kind of very aggressive support that the government has come out with is absolutely right. I kind of was an early advocate of things like the furlough scheme. What we really, really needed, particularly early on, was buying ourselves the optionality to kind of return back to normal if that was going to be possible. And early on, there was still a chance that this would be a V-shaped recovery. It was worth throwing everything at that in order to buy ourselves that optionality, try and maintain the connections that Wendy was talking about, keep people in jobs, stop businesses from making difficult decisions to lay people off, stop businesses closing. And also the costs of this, to the extent that there are one-off costs in fiscal terms, one-off costs when you are able to borrow at negative real interest rates are not really a concern. I'll come on to the fiscal picture, but there is a distinction, I think, that, and the Treasury is rightly should be less worried about big one-off costs, which is what we hope a lot of this is, one-off grants, one-off furlough scheme. That's very, very different from a kind of recurring cost, which is going to be both kind of practically and politically difficult to remove in future. So therefore, I think err on the side of the Treasury have been right to err on the side of kind of doing too much in terms of big one-off costs. There is the difficult question is going to arise gradually of how to exit from these things. I think we're already seeing actually some calibration going on. We've seen interesting, the airline industry is a classic case. We're already seeing airlines take difficult decisions to make permanent reductions in their size and sadly, reduce jobs. And that is probably, frankly, sad but necessary. I don't think it should be, for example, a goal of government policy right now to preserve the size of the airline sector as it is, until we decide at some point down the line, okay, now we'll release support and let the airline sector, shrink to whatever its sustainable size is going to be. I think it probably is quite sensible now. We need to start making that adjustment. Even if we get a strong recovery, the world is going to look very different for several years, and we are not going to have the level of airline, aviation and airline travel. So you do need to start making that adjustment now. Of course, the support needs to be in place from a macroeconomic and an individual point of view to deal with that, but we can't seek to preserve all parts of the economy kind of frozen in aspect now. We do need to start thinking about how we manage transition to a different kind of economy, and sadly that is going to mean some very difficult things in a lot of sectors. Third point on the sort of overall fiscal situation, I think Alistair mentioned the crucial thing, which is the World War II analogy, and the crucial change that has happened is that central banks around the world have crossed a very, very important Rubicon over the last few months, in that they are now either explicitly or implicitly practicing yield curve control. So what the Japanese have been doing explicitly, what we now have explicitly in Australia, I think is very, very clear that the Federal Reserve is now doing that implicitly. They're essentially standing behind government fiscal policy. They are essentially guaranteeing that the yield curves, i.e. the interest rate on government debt, is going to stay very, very contained and very, very low. I think there are some central bankers who are slightly worried that they have crossed this Rubicon, and they kind of wonder where it will all end, but it's happened and we're not going back anytime soon. So therefore we are in a very, very different world when it comes to thinking about the fiscal outlook. This is what happened in the exit from World War II. We did have central banks explicitly standing behind fiscal authorities. And I think we are now going to be in that situation for some time. So we can think differently about there is just a higher level of debt that is sustainable in an environment where central banks are anchoring yield curves really for the foreseeable future. And that means that we don't have to worry, at least for now, about how we are going to deal with those very high levels of debt. I suspect they will be with us for a very, very long time. They will come down very gradually with the help of financial repression through yield curve control. I think governments will be trying to gradually raise taxes very, very gradually over time, particularly because we have, in a sense, learnt that there is a new government entitlement out there, which is disaster insurance. We didn't really know that was there so explicitly, but the corporate sector and large parts of the labour force now know that the government is the disaster insurer of last resort. And for an insurance policy, there needs to be a premium to pay for that policy eventually. And I think that will come through over time in terms of through the tax system. It was interesting that Rishi Sunak, when he announced the self-employed support mechanism, said, well, there will have to be some reckoning on this in the tax system, in the sense that the self-employed are treated more generously, and that this is a new entitlement for the self-employed, but that can now expect to be treated differently in the future, and therefore that will have to be reflected over time, I think, in the way that we raise revenue. But as I say, because of yield curve control, that is not going to be urgent. I think what is the risk to that statement about the fiscal sustainability of this very, very high debt situation? As before, really it's about inflation. In a sense, we have sort of come to the world as described. I mean, I don't really agree with modern monetary theory, but we have really come to that world. We have the kind of full fiscal dominance. Policy is led by finance departments and fiscal policy, and really the binding constraint is inflation. That's really how modern monetary theory sees the world, that you should basically spend as much money, and then when you have inflation rising, that's when you need to use, in the case of MMT, fiscal policy to control demand in order to not let inflation go out of control. I suspect we don't need to worry about inflation for some time. There will be some inflation coming in out of this recession, because you'll get oil prices and commodity prices bouncing right back up from effectively zero. This is a very, very tight market that trades on very, very narrow margins. So we will get kind of cost plus inflation, as we normally do coming out of in this recovery, but that won't be the kind of inflation that I think markets or policymakers should be concerned about, because we will at the same time sadly have for some time very high unemployment rates and output gaps, and that will put sort of downward pressure on inflation for some time. So I suspect that that's going to be the thing we need to keep an eye on. If we get into a situation with very, very high sustained debt levels, anchored interest rates, because central banks are essentially kind of dominated by finance ministries, and we get inflation starting to get out of control, that's a much nastier situation which we'll have to confront maybe one day, but I suspect not for a very, very long time. And then finally, just one final point about the private sector exit from this, and particularly the corporate sector. I do think it's right that we should be concerned about the overall levels of leverage in the corporate sector coming out of this, because I think we are going to find a lot of companies from small to large seeking to build up cash levels, seeking to reduce the amount of debt on their balance sheets, improve their balance sheets coming out of this. That will be sort of individually rational for each of those companies or small businesses to do that, but collectively that could be a very, very big drag on growth. And so I think we do need to think about how we sort of essentially a kind of big re-equitization of the corporate sector. And I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. In a sense, Alistair had to deal with a very, very difficult situation in 2008, 2009, but he only had to recapitalize 4 or 5 large banks. So the sort of complexity of that task was at least kind of relatively confined. If we're trying to think about how to improve the balance sheets of thousands and thousands of private sector businesses, that's a much more difficult task. And we have to think largely about kind of market mechanisms and tax incentives to help do that. I think for the smallest companies, and particularly where government guaranteed loans are in play, I think there will have to be a discussion down the line about forgiveness. And I suspect a lot of these 100% guaranteed loans will end up being grants de facto. And it might well be that, again, as a one-off cost, that may be worth it. If you want to avoid a corporate sector that is kind of crippled by debt and unable to expand because of that, it may be worth at the smaller size thinking about debt forgiveness, and then elsewhere we should be maybe thinking about mechanisms, large-scale mechanisms to swap debt for equity, or to co-invest in equity injections, or some way to kind of re-equitize the corporate sector, because I think this kind of slow attempt at deleveraging could be a very, very big drag on growth as we come out. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rupert. And just, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on the comparison with 2010. What you think, I mean, you make the point about fiscal policy dominating now, But what would your advice be on the appropriate pace of fiscal consolidation if we have a kind of not the worst case scenario coming out of the health aspect of this crisis, not the best, but something in between? How would you compare and contrast what you did in 2010 to what you would do now in terms of consolidation?
So I think there are two very, very important differences. One is perhaps less important, is this difference between kind of one-off costs versus recurring costs. So the 2010 situation was the size of the economy was significantly smaller than had been thought, particularly because of the shrinkage in the finance sector. So a very, very large proportion of UK revenues had come from finance. Those revenues basically disappeared, were not coming back anytime soon, and therefore you had this kind of permanent and recurring hole in the public finances. That's a much more difficult issue to deal with, where you have a 10% deficit year after year. That has to be addressed, and Alistair left office in 2010 with a plan in place to do that. The debate wasn't that no one had a plan to do that. It was about exactly how fast you do that. There was no debate about whether that needed to be done, because those recurring costs are much more problematic in a fiscal sense than one-off costs, particularly now when you've got negative real interest rates. I think the bigger change is what I've talked about in terms of monetary policy and global interest rates. So I think even actually before the crisis, the big change for me was really, I think, late 2018. So back in 2010, and indeed through much of the last decade, we were in an environment where interest rates had been cut very low, quantitative easing had been, the innovative policy that had been put in place, but markets and any kind of risk-aware planning by governments had to plan for a scenario in which interest rates would gradually return to more normal levels. And indeed, we could see that in markets in the sense that the US 10-year yield, the yield on US 10-year debt, which is essentially the kind of anchor for global bond markets, actually went above 3% in late 2018. So we finally saw expectations of our market participants, and therefore governments thinking in a kind of risk-aware basis, thinking, okay, there is a slow convergence of interest rates back to more normal levels. You have to think about fiscal sustainability in that context. That turned out to be unsustainable, and at the end of 2018 and into 2019, it turned out that monetary policy was far too tight. The Federal Reserve did a massive turnaround. The yield onto US 10-year debt fell down to 1.5%. And I think for me, that was a moment even before coronavirus where actually kind of finally it was okay, that there is really very, very little prospect now of returning to a kind of normal interest rate environment, even pre-coronavirus. Now with this shock, the impact on demand globally, the impact on indebtedness around the world, and the fact that central banks have now moved in and effectively are now standing behind fiscal authorities with yield curve control, we are in a totally different world to 2010. In that governments can't plan solely on the basis of their central expectation. They have to be aware of different risk scenarios. So when you're thinking about your fiscal sustainability, you have to think, okay, what are the bad things that could happen? What could happen to our interest? We have to basically be, Alistair was talking about resilience. We have to be resilient to kind of bad outcomes in terms of what might happen to our interest rates, what might happen to tolerance for indebtedness amongst large economies. But now that the sort of risk spectrum has just narrowed dramatically. I think I don't think the Treasury needs to plan on the basis of a return to normal interest rates anytime soon. And that is therefore a very, very different world. And we can, I think, be more relaxed about managing high debt profiles. I do think we still need to see this as something that needs to be dealt with, but it probably needs to be dealt with similar to after the Second World War on a kind of multi-decade basis. It's something that we're going to have to confront for some time. It's much less urgent than it was in 2010.
Okay, great. Now we have a variety of different questions coming in from different people. I've got a question here from John Rentoul at The Independent, who's asking, follows on, I guess, from what you were just saying, Rupert, but is there a tipping point for debt as a percentage of national income at which bad stuff happens? Obviously, we didn't hit that point after 2008, but do the panel think that is still something we need to worry about? Wendy, I don't know whether you want to kick off on that.
Yeah, no, I think that this is certainly not something that should be that we should be spending our time worrying about, for the reasons that Rupert has just explained. We are, and there's just a lot of evidence that we're in a low for long interest rate environment out into the future. And that's a reflection, if you like, of the weakness of investment spending globally. So it's a symptom of a problem, And there's no way that we're getting around that problem in this crisis. So this is, you know, just piled a huge new depressive set of circumstances onto a world that was already one in which interest rates were going to be low out into the future. So and in terms of public communication, I really think this is very important. And Rupert's very eloquently kind of stepped through the argument. And I think that stepping through the argument has not taken place with a broader public. And that's really a problem for good policy making and bringing people along with the strategy that needs to be implemented as we go forward. So it's a great thing that fiscal and monetary policy are working together in the circumstances that we face. It was also very important to separate the roles of fiscal and monetary policy under different circumstances. So that balance between fiscal and monetary policy really is contingent on the state of the economy. And for, you know, sometimes kind of very simple mantras just keep getting repeated. And that's definitely interfering, I think, with a good understanding of the role of policy at present. And just to kind of finish it up with the inflation, the usual inflation point, which is, you know, you still see repeated frequently that the two things, the expansion of public debt and the expansion of central bank balance sheets, is bound to cause inflation. And this is simply not true. And so if you just think of, there could be, even in this corona virus crisis, there was a bit of an inflation shock from supply chain interruptions. There's no way of transmitting that through into rising inflation, given the depressed state of the labor market that's going to be with us for a very long time. And understanding how inflation gets transmitted through the economy is really crucial, and somehow getting away from this idea that the big central bank balance sheets, big government debt is going to cause inflation. That's not helpful.
Ian, can I just jump in there quickly? I totally agree with that. I think it's something also that we need to be very aware of the value of our institutions in that framework. So one of the reasons why the UK can get away with this now is because the world has an enormous amount of faith in our monetary and fiscal institutions, and particularly in the central bank, and the fact that they are not going to kind of basically print money and finance the government indefinitely, and particularly that they won't do that if inflation is getting out of control. I agree, it's very, very unlikely that inflation would get out of control, but the problem is if you lose the trust in your institutions, you can flip into being like an emerging market country. So the problem, if you're South Africa at the moment, or Turkey or Argentina, the problem is markets don't trust your institutions. And if they think that you are effectively going to start monetizing government debt, your currency will start to fall. That will drive up inflation, which will make markets even more concerned. And that's when you get into a kind of death spiral and you end up going to the IMF and defaulting on your debt. And it's the only thing that is keeping us from that is the trust and faith of the world in our institutions. And therefore, I think it's very, I know that something that UK policymakers are very worried about is the sort of extrapolation. Well, if we can do this in this crisis, why can't we just print money all the time to fund all the wonderful things that we want to spend money on? And that is exactly the kind of policy mix that would start to undermine faith in our institutions. Then that's when we actually wouldn't have the luxury of doing what we can do now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that also helps to underline why I don't think interpreting the way that fiscal and monetary policy are working together as MMT is a good way of interpreting it. Because, no,
I mean, I was just saying that the constraint, in a sense, is inflation. That was the kind of parallel I was.
Yeah, sure. But I think you made the more important point that the balance of policy has to be state dependent. It has to depend on what situation the economy is in, and there are really good reasons for the fact that we don't normally think of monetary policy as as directly financing government expenditure. So, you know, we don't want to go too far, if you know what I mean. So so MMT, there's some of it's right, but I don't think it's a good general framework for thinking about the relationship between the fiscal and the monetary policy maker.
Agreed.
Okay, great. Let's move on to Heather Grab. Heather has a question on the possibilities of the crisis for dealing with things like accelerating the climate transition. Heather, do you want to come in there?
Yes, thanks. It's especially the way that economic paradigms are changing. And so the political economy of climate transition is changing as well. And so I just really wanted to get your views on what new possibilities this crisis has opened up for financing climate transition and sending the right signals for behavioral change among companies as well as among consumers that Wendy mentioned earlier is really essential. I mean, a couple of things you've mentioned are you know, perhaps changing away from austerity in a big way and to the idea that public finance, debt finance, is acceptable on a much larger scale. And so could that be used, for example, to have a much faster transition to energy efficiency through insulating housing, etc. And the other one is tax. Does it open up new possibilities, given that all governments are looking for new sources of revenue? So the idea of introducing carbon taxes much faster than was previously seen as possible or feasible, especially if it makes sense to reduce taxes on labour, given the problems with the labour market that you've mentioned. Thanks.
Okay, and thanks for that, Heather. And I might also bring in Jonathan Mallinson's question here. He's also thinking about how we make the judgment about which industries we support without conditions and how we restructure coming out of this, which I think touches on some similar points. So Jonathan, do you want to ask your question at this point?
Yeah, hi there. I'm just, I suppose, building on the points that Heather has made. These feel like really difficult kind of and complex political judgments as much as they are economic judgments. And so to illustrate with the example you used, Rupert, of the airline industry, you know, how and who decides which of these industries we do support, which we don't, which we support to kind of restructure and reorientate towards a kind of a green transition, etc. What does that process look like?
Great, thanks. Okay, who wants to pick that set of questions up first? Wendy, does it make sense?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of, I mean, since we're in a situation in which there's a great deal necessarily of government intervention, then it seems sensible that that is designed. So in terms of the tax, the design of the tax increases that will eventually be needed for the reasons that Rupert was pointing to, as well as for all kinds of other reasons. The design of QE, so the way that QE can be designed to be more supportive of green, of zero carbon outcomes, and policies for jobs. So the home insulation is one that people often mention, that is a way of activating people who may lose jobs elsewhere in the economy. So I think it's a matter of putting in place the framework that's going to have to be there in the future, and using that as a way of helping individuals and businesses to make and banks to make decisions themselves. So rather than kind of picking winners, if you like, or say picking the airline industry, you make it clear the way the airline industry is going to have to be out into the future, and that will almost certainly, under the current circumstances, bring forward adjustments that would have happened much later had the coronavirus coronavirus crisis not occurred.
So Rupert, do you want either of you want to come in on that question, the set of questions?
Alistair, I've got some thoughts. I think that I go partly on the climate change point and the sort of net zero transition. My first point would be to go back to the previous discussion. Say I think that the sort of temptation to extrapolate from the fact that we've been able to deploy massive resources through borrowing to deal with this current crisis, therefore we must be able to automatically do the same for climate transition, is tempting, but I think dangerous. I think if we basically say there's no budget constraint on government anymore and we can spend whatever we like because the Bank of England will finance it, that is gradually inching down a slippery slope which ends very, very badly. So I think we need to maintain a sort of overall framework that, as I say, maintains kind of faith in our institutions, and that we are not going to start trying to get a free lunch on every spending priority.
But Rupert, is there can I just come in on that? I mean, there's a naive version of it, which I think you're right on, that you can't just hang loads of, bring in your hobby horses and let's pay for everything. But there's a smarter version, which is kind of what Wendy was touching on, which is that the shape of the economy is going to change.
Yes.
We're going to maximise our living standards. We need to encourage that transition. Is there? Do you, with a Treasury perspective on aspects, you
no. Look, so what I was coming on to was that there are things that we should. We clearly need to make this transition, and it's it's an emergency on a longer timescale, but it's still something we need to do. And this is an opportunity. So I totally agree with, if we are going to have to, I think, raise taxes at some point in the future, trying to do that in a way that is taxing carbon largely and trying to kind of, iron out the kind of lumpy incentives that we have in our economy in that space would be a good thing to do. Also, we are going to be struggling with high unemployment for quite some time. So I think we are still going to have broadly supportive fiscal policy for some time, and therefore the government is planning to spend a lot of money on infrastructure anyway. Great thing about a lot of infrastructure is that you can build it outside. I only say that slightly flippantly. I think we are going to have to start differentiating between different activities. We are not going to be putting people who are unemployed into kind of packed classrooms to learn things in classrooms, because no one's going to be doing that for quite some time. Whereas, investing in things where people can be outside building, high-speed rail or, it's only slightly flippant, but we do need to think about kind of activities that actually can be successfully financed by governments. In terms of how we support which industries, I think as far as possible we should try and have the government standing behind the economy, but allowing the market to decide which industries are going to have to adjust by how much, because I don't think government should be getting into that. I think that they will have to make some decisions. So inevitably, when we come out of the furlough scheme gradually, I think that may end up having to be sort of different for different industries, because if government is enforcing a shutdown of a certain sector for longer than another sector, it stands to reason that it should stand behind that sector for longer, as long as there is some prospect of it returning to something like normal activity further down the line, perhaps post a vaccine or something like that. But I think that the airline is a good example. The airlines are making these decisions by themselves under pressure from creditors and equity owners, and management are making those decisions, and banks are making decisions with them about what they're willing to lend to. Same thing is happening in the retail sector. There was a huge transition happening in retail anyway. As far as possible, those decisions should be made in the normal way. With the government, I think it would be a risk if government became the kind of arbiter of who can continue as before and who has to make changes.
I would agree with that, but I think what the government could usefully do, though, is to start looking at what we need to do if we are going to become carbon neutral by 2050 or 2040, because I've never seen anybody ever spell out what exactly we need to do. And having worked out what you need to do, then you adjust your policy, and part of it will be tax incentives, my guess is. Part of it will be the need to retrain people, to refocus what they do. And as Rupert had just said quite rightly, unfortunately, there will be high levels of unemployment as we come out of this, and the government will have to intervene. And the question will be, well, what should we be directing people to do? But again, we need to be planning for that in a way that, frankly, we haven't been doing. If we're going to have any chance to get the long-term recovery. And now, just going back to the John Rantoul's question, I'll just add this, that whilst I agree with Wendy and Rupert that, as far as we are concerned, and countries like ours, people don't doubt our creditworthiness, and they see we're doing this for a very important purpose of getting through this crisis. I do worry about the fact that an awful lot of countries in the world are heavily indebted already, are not regarded as being, particularly creditworthy, and they are going to be in real problems. And this lack of willingness at an international level to, for example, give the IMF more firepower it will have to be debt forgiveness, my guess is, because otherwise we're going to have another problem. It isn't just a moral question, it's an economic problem. It's not, it's no way to run an economy where you've got half the world, with severe debt problems. So I think we're okay just now. And frankly, you get very esoteric discussions about debt, inflation and monetary policy and fiscal policy and the rest of it. The key thing is to make sure that we have got something on which to build when we come out of this.
Okay, great. Now we are running out of time, so I will go first to Francis Coppola, who's got some questions about the microeconomic policy response in the labour market. Then I'll come to Matt Ford, who's got a question about what the impact of this is on politics. And then finally, Andrew Adonis will broaden it right out and think about the impact of this on relations with China. So Francis, if we can unmute you, do you want to kick us off?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, I have a couple of questions. The first is at the Economist briefing at the National Institute yesterday, they had a fairly strong call for sizable government investment projects coming out of this, both at national and at regional level, on the grounds that fiscal multipliers would be very large. They said they were quite large after the financial crisis, but they would be much larger this time. Therefore, it was a good use of public funds. I wondered what the panelists thought about that. And my second question is kind of related to that, because there's been, we are obviously going to have high unemployment for quite a long time, but we also have job shortages in critical areas, labour shortages in critical areas, and also potentially if we have big investment projects, we'll need to staff them. Is there a case for a government job guarantee scheme?
Okay, great, thanks. And then quickly to Matt, do you want to ask your question, Matt?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I just wondered what your thoughts would be on how the post-crisis politics will differ from those after the financial crash. For instance, do you think the Conservatives would now be happy to live with high levels of public borrowing, and how high is high?
Okay, great. And finally, Andrew Adonis.
Very simple. Where do we go with China after this?
Great, thank you. So we've got each of you have about a minute and a half. Wendy, can I start with you?
Multipliers are high, yes. So it's very short and sweet indeed. So it's good to be, it's a good time to be doing projects with a very high social return. And especially, as was mentioned earlier, to the extent they're outdoors and they are climate friendly. So yes, indeed. Job guarantee scheme, I think it's definitely something that is worth considering under these particular circumstances. So on both of those, I would suggest we should be thinking in that direction.
Okay, great. Alistair, what about your thoughts?
Well, do them in reverse order. Andrew's point about China, China is a very big economy. We have to deal with China. All I would say is we just have to understand what they see as their interests, and we need to respond accordingly, but we need to engage. I think as far as Matt's question is concerned, will politics change? Well, at least now we've got a competent and functioning opposition, so that might just help try and shape a debate, something we haven't had for far too long. I think any government, regardless of its political colour, in the light of what's happening just now, would have to adopt a policy of supporting the economy in the way that we did 10 years ago. Of course that won't endure, because there will people who come back and say it's the wrong thing to do, and that we should be going back to where we were, austerity mark 2. Of course there'll be people like that. I'm not qualified to tell you what's going to happen within the Conservative Party, but my guess is the Prime Minister is more of a Keynesian today than he might have been 3 or 4 months ago. In relation to Francis's point, I very much agree that local infrastructure investment by the government is important, which and is actually more productive. I mean, my at risk of falling out with Andrew, and happily he can't come back at me just now, is I've always thought that HS2 was a mistake, and you'd be far better spending the money on smaller transport schemes, particularly outside the southeast of England, because that's what's so desperately needed, and you can get them going quickly. And they employ people, and add to our long-term prosperity. There's not just transport and broadband capacity and the rest of it. So yes, I'm in favour of that. And then job guarantee schemes. Well, it may well come to that. I just repeat the point that what's needed now is some leadership. What's needed now is a plan, not just for the immediate future, but the fact the world will be changing. But there are opportunities here, and the ones that will get the prizes are the ones who think about it now.
Hey, Rupert, finally to you.
So very quickly, yes, public investment schemes. I mean, I suspect that the constraint on that is going to be the capacity to plan, manage and implement them, because the government already has a pretty ambitious agenda of scaling up public sector spending in that space. So I think, yes, but we should do some investment now in terms of the capacity of that sector, in terms of construction planning, and have a long-term plan in that space. Job guarantee schemes, I mean, whatever works. I think with high unemployment in recessions, you need active labour market policies, whether that is job subsidies or training or whatever works. We have a sort of history of doing these things. Some of them work better than others. I think we should be trying it all effectively, and I'm sure the Treasury will be. Post-crash politics, I think there will be some Conservatives who will worry about public sector debt, but I think the argument we were talking earlier about how this is a very different world will temper some of the so they will live with it. I certainly agree that Boris Johnson has no appetite for a kind of big austerity program, and I think we will be dealing with very high debt and gradually trying to keep it under control, but with no urgency, because of the totally different environment we find ourselves in, as we discussed earlier. I think a very interesting question for Labour Party politics is Keir Starmer. I think there'll be a lot of pressure on the Labour leadership to sort of go for the if we did this for the crisis, why can't we do it for everything else approach, basically the sort of free money approach, or the Bank of England can print money for everything. I think that if Labour policy kind of veers into that space, I think there's a risk of a sort of severe loss of credibility there. So hopefully he won't. And then finally, with China, there's going to be a massive issue. It was already going to be a massive issue for the next decade. UK policy, we won't be setting UK policy towards China in a vacuum. There is going to be a massive escalation of tensions between the US and China over the next few years. It's already happening. This crisis has only inflamed it further. The US election is going to be dominated by China. Almost whoever is president, the kind of shift in mood within the US, and particularly in Congress towards China, means that we are going to be sort of caught in the middle of a very vicious sort of multi-dimensional rivalry between the two countries. Maybe if Joe Biden wins the election, it might be slightly less intense, but I think the congressional pressure will be the same, and therefore the UK, I think, needs to sort of strike a very, very difficult balance of not being entirely slavishly following a kind of aggressive US commercial and security policy, while at the same time clearly confronting China on some pretty unacceptable behaviours in a whole range of areas.
Probably not the ideal time to be diverging from your European colleagues on some of these matters. But anyway, that's not topic for another day. Look, thanks to all our panelists. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I think we've covered a huge amount of ground, and that could have made 5 or 6 webinars, but we will be doing further topics in the future, so do come back and join us for those. Thanks again to our panelists, and I hope you all have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.